Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Pope and I'm excited to talk to you about child hunger and education. Four of the themes that exist for child hunger and education are food insecurity and poverty, risk factors of child hunger, federal and private feeding programs, which I'm excited to talk about, and the effects of hunger on children and education. So let's look at the first one, food insecurity and poverty. Well, what is food insecurity? Well, the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, defines it as not enough food eaten due to the lack of money or other resources. You do not get enough to eat to live a healthy lifestyle. So, in order to determine who is food insecure, USDA has a food insecurity module survey that's 18 questions. Some of those are related to child hunger, so we do get statistics on that. And they're asking questions in the household. Are meals being skipped? Are there times when you don't have enough money to provide food for the entire month? And they're constantly doing these surveys. How many people are hungry and what are the demographics of the folks who are hungry? Well, in 2008, for example, we had 15% of our households were food insecure, and that number continues to rise, although sometimes it'll decline and then go back up depending on the economy. There's 2 times the food insecurity rate for households that have children. And in 2011, almost 17 million children were food insecure. Children have a higher food insecurity rate compared to adults, obviously, and then 78% of children in the United States are eligible for federal feeding programs, and we'll talk about what programs those are here in a little bit. Childhood hunger, poverty, and more is associated with childhood hunger. Poverty is linked to negative health outcomes for children as well, and obviously if you're living in poverty, your family does not have enough money for food, rent, utilities, medicine, all of those things. But there are other reasons for childhood hunger. Lack of having a grocery store near your family's home, lack of gainful and consistent employment in your household, a large household, lots of people that are living in the household, and then not participating in federal feeding programs. And we'll talk about those. SNAP, for example, the old food stamp program. And it could be lack of education. You don't know about those programs. Also, food insecurity and poverty, we have predictors of hunger. How can we predict hunger? Well, the performance in school. If we are not developing on the child level, and there's poverty or family issues, could be predictors of hunger. For example, the performance in school, the academic performance in school, child hunger is a significant predictor of poor kindergarten outcomes, for example, lower educational attainment, higher probability of repeating a grade. And what about child development? Well, increased hyperactivity could be a predictor of hunger, less ability to control your behavior, internalizing behavior problems, and slow psychological development. Well, what about poverty? Of course, a high level of poverty, even generational poverty, can be a predictor of hunger. Children who live in poverty have an increased probability of poor academic performance, and then childhood poverty limits adequate health care for our children. And then lastly, you have high food insecurity in neighborhoods with high poverty. And then family issues. Depression in the mother, for example, mental and physical challenges of the parents, domestic violence in the home, job loss, low educational attainment of the parents, for example, can all be predictors of hunger. And how are minorities affected? Well, we've heard through the pandemic that our minority populations are affected more by the pandemic, and they have worse outcomes, and they are struggling with hunger more. For example, the Hispanics have a higher rate of hunger on a national average. And most Hispanics that are food insecure in Texas, for example, live in the border towns. So we know that coming across the border from Mexico or being born in Mexico, also you have a higher probability of food insecurity. African Americans, for example, they face hunger at a rate of more than 2 times their white counterparts, and 1 in 4 African American children struggle with hunger. Other marginalized groups, we have some groups of Somalians that have a higher rate of hunger, recent immigrants, for example, and then disadvantaged minority children have a higher risk of hunger. And what about poverty? Well, poverty is when individuals and families do not have enough income to meet their basic needs. And the federal government has a federal threshold for poverty, and they use that threshold to determine eligibility for some of the federal programs that we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. What are the impacts of poverty on hunger? Well, again, behavior problems in children at school, lower academic achievement, particularly with those with disabilities, and lower language skills. What are some risk factors for childhood hunger? Well, we've got impairments. Impairments could be academic or psychosocial. So impairments for academic would be missing school, being absent from school more, is a risk for childhood hunger. If you have hyperactivity in the classroom, depression as a child is also an impairment. And then minority status would be a risk factor. We've talked about the minorities face a higher rate of food insecurity, and then minority children experience racism, and that can be a risk factor. Also, again, the violence and sexual molestation on the part of the mother, the negative childhood experiences in the home. And then housing issues with segregated neighborhoods, because that brings about schools that have less resources, and neighborhoods that might not be safe. Risk for child hunger if you live in a rented home or you receive housing subsidies and have a large number of children in the home. All of those are risk of childhood hunger. This is the great part, federal and private feeding programs. I think unless you're in food insecurity, you're not quite aware of what all we have, but we have some federal feeding programs that folks struggling with hunger can take advantage of. So we're going to talk about WIC. WIC is the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infant, and children. And it has certain guidelines so that they're getting food from all the major food groups, helping pregnant women and their children. And then SNAP, we talked a little bit about that. That's the old food stamp program. It stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And this is where we have the poorest of the poor are on our SNAP program. And the benefit, for example, in 2018 was the average was $255 a month. And that will vary depending on the size of your household. What happened, the positive effects is at least it is that first line of defense against hunger because you have SNAP benefits on an EBT card that you can buy food. The SFSP, that's the Summer Food Service Program, and this is run by sponsors of this USDA program, and they are providing our children meals when they're out of school. You're reimbursed by the federal government through USDA for every meal served. And it's because they don't have access to the free and reduced lunches at school, which brings us to NSLP, the National School Lunch Program. This is the second largest food assistance program that the federal government runs, and it came about from the 1966 Child Nutrition Act, and it has to be reauthorized every 5 years. This act. The majority of students using this program are minorities. TANF, you're not going to hear a lot about that. That's really a federal program for trying to get families self-sustaining. A lot less to do with food, although food is in there, has a little bit more to do with rental assistance and utility assistance. And then finally, CACFP, that is our child and adult care food program, and it started to provide so that you could provide food for children and seniors in care facilities, daycare facilities, homeless homeless shelters. And after school, it's mainly used for after school snacks for an enrichment program like YMCA might have after school snacks for the children who are in those enrichment programs. It has strict patterns for nutritionist meals, and you have to have a sponsor that runs that program, like the school system or YMCA or a food bank perhaps. And then what is HHFKA? So this stands for the Healthy Hungry Food, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act of 2010. And this came about and changed the nutritional content for the school lunch programs. And Mrs. Obama was an advocate for this program, but some of the opposition is it led to increased food waste because of the strict nutritional guidelines. But schools are still working through some of the mechanics of making that an improved program. And then what is CEP? Well, the community eligibility provision was really a great provision for this act because it expanded access to the school lunches. So the schools with high poverty rate, they had free meals for all and not just those who would qualify. And then the private feeding programs. Food banks hold a great portion of the food of feeding those who are food insecure in the country. There are 200 food banks that work through Feeding America, and some of them have backpack programs that feed children on the weekend. But the food banks are providing food for your soup kitchens, your food pantries right down the road. And that's how the majority of people are fed through our food banks or with our partner agencies. And then to wrap this up, these are the effects of hunger on children and education, early childhood development. The family economic circumstances really play a part on this because struggling with poverty, unemployment, it really has a prediction of the educational outcome for our children. And then academics, assessment and behavior. So school readiness assessments. If you're struggling with hunger, you're not going to be ready for school, and then you're going to have behavioral problems, whether it's hyperactivity or depression. Emotional overall health for emotional and physical. So you've got, it can affect the overall health of our children. If you're struggling with hunger, you are 2 times as likely to have been seen by a psychiatrist and 4 times as likely to have 0 friends. And then, of course, the poor health, the physical health, it leads to that less nutrition is leading to increased chronic conditions, as well as just poor physical health. Obviously, you're not going to feel good if you're hungry. But we're going to close on a positive note with the mitigating the effects of hunger on children. One thing that we can do is that we can improve the health care access for our children and make sure that the doctors know how to spot food insecurity with our children. And then the food programs expanded. The USDA does a great job of providing the food banks food, for example, but that could be expanded, and we've seen that recently through the Farmers to Families Food Box program during the pandemic that allowed food banks to and other organizations to get larger quantities of fresh produce, dairy products. You saw farmers were having to get rid of milk. So a good way is just to increase the supply of food coming in to the food banks. And expand child development programs, the enrichment programs, so that they're at school locations, and we can run these federal feeding programs, CACFP, for example, on a greater scale to feed our children. And then education. You don't know what you don't know. So educating people and getting the word out about federal feeding programs that they may qualify for. SNAP, for example. 40% of our seniors don't know that they qualify for SNAP. So a lot of people are not taking advantage of existing federal feeding programs that can mitigate the effects of hunger. Thank you for your time. I want you to see references that I have, and I enjoyed telling you about the thing that I love, child hunger and education.